This is a book review of the book, Loving Someone with Borderline Personality Disorder, by author Shari Manning. Stay tuned to hear what some readers of the book had to say and to listen to a preview of the audio version of the book, as we take a deep dive into this book and subject.
All right, buckle up everyone, because today we're taking a deep dive into a book that really grabbed my attention, Loving Someone with Borderline Personality Disorder by Dr. Shari Manning. And seeing Marsha Linehan, like the BBT pioneer, write the foreword, well, let's just say I knew we had to dig into this one.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a topic that needs all the light we can shine on it. BPD, it's often misunderstood. But one thing Dr. Manning makes crystal clear is that it's not about folks with BPD being difficult. It's about the intense emotions they experience. Emotions that can be so overwhelming, so hard to manage, that they end up impacting every aspect of their lives, especially their relationships.
So we're talking about more than just the usual relationship bumps in the road here. This book tackles those situations where those really intense emotions fueled by BPD can lead to behaviors that unintentionally push loved ones away. It's like this heartbreaking cycle. And what really struck me about this book is that it goes beyond just understanding the why behind these behaviors. It gives us, the listeners, the tools to respond in a way that actually helps.
And those tools are rooted in something pretty powerful: Dialectical Behavior Therapy, or DBT for short. Now, Dr. Manning has a real knack for taking these clinically proven DBT techniques and making them accessible to anyone who loves someone with BPD.
It's like she's built this bridge between the therapy room and everyday life, which is so important. Because, therapy's not always an option for all sorts of reasons.
Absolutely. And even when it is, having this kind of practical guidance at your fingertips, well, it can make a world of difference. It's like you're not just left with theories, you're equipped with these real-world strategies.
Right, exactly. It's about actually being able to do something, to make a change.
Exactly. But, it's important to emphasize that while this book can be incredibly empowering, it's not meant to replace professional help when it's needed. Think of it more like having a knowledgeable guide by your side, helping you navigate all those twists and turns.
Yeah, like a roadmap for those tricky BPD moments in a relationship. Speaking of tricky, one thing that really hit home for me was this idea that people with BPD often crave connection and love just as much as anyone else, but then their actions, driven by that intense fear of abandonment, can end up pushing away the very people they care about most. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it?
It really is. And that's precisely why understanding the underlying mechanisms of BPD becomes so crucial. And the book does a fantastic job of illustrating this with real-life examples, like the one from Seattle Reviewer, who describes living with a partner with suspected BPD.
Oh, right, Seattle Reviewer. They talked about that feeling of walking on eggshells all the time, afraid of saying or doing anything that might trigger an outburst. That constant feeling of being on edge, it must be exhausting.
Oh, it is. Incredibly draining. And unfortunately, it's a common experience for those in relationships with people with BPD. That constant worry about triggering these intense emotional reactions, it can lead to resentment, frustration, a sense of just feeling helpless.
And that's where I think DBT comes in, right? It's not just about managing symptoms on the surface. It's about fundamentally changing how you interact and react in those challenging moments.
Exactly. DBT gives you this framework for understanding and responding to these challenges in a way that promotes both individual and relational well-being. It's not a magic bullet, of course, no quick fix, but it's a set of skills you can learn, practice, and get better at over time.
And one of the most powerful skills Dr. Manning highlights is validation. But I gotta admit, I stumbled a bit with this concept at first. I initially thought validation meant agreeing with everything my loved one was saying or doing, even when it felt wrong.
Yeah, that's a common misconception.
Yeah.
But validation isn't about condoning or enabling any harmful behavior. It's about communicating to the other person that you understand and acknowledge their feelings, even if you don't agree with them.
Okay, so it's more about acknowledging the emotion itself, not necessarily the actions that come from it.
Exactly. You got it. It's about creating this space where the other person feels heard and understood. And believe me, that can be incredibly powerful in de-escalating those heated moments.
That makes a lot more sense now. And it's great that the book gives examples of how this plays out in real life.
Right. Like Rajni Gupta's story, the reader who found the book helpful, they shared how validating their loved one's anger actually led to a decrease in those outbursts.
Wow, that's incredible. So it's not just some touchy-feely technique. It can actually create real shifts in the relationship.
Exactly. Tangible changes. And the key here is that validation isn't about giving in or letting your loved one walk all over you. It's about finding that balance between empathy and setting healthy boundaries.
Ah, boundaries. That feels like walking a tightrope sometimes. Too permissive on one side, too rigid on the other. But this book really drives home the point that boundaries are essential. Not just for protecting yourself, but for the health of the relationship as a whole.
Couldn't agree more. Setting boundaries isn't about control. It's about creating a safe and sustainable space for both people to thrive. It's about communicating your needs and limits while still being caring and supportive.
And I love that the book doesn't just say set boundaries and leave it at that. It actually gives you a roadmap for doing it effectively.
Oh yeah, Dr. Manning introduces this 5-step process for navigating those tough conversations and de-escalating those emotionally charged moments.
Okay, you've got me hooked. We need to unpack this 5-step process.
We absolutely do. It's a game changer. But you know what? I think it deserves its own spotlight, its own deep dive. Let's save it for our next segment. What do you say?
Your emotions may feel like a storm, but within you lies the strength to weather it. Every day you face challenges, you prove that you are more than your diagnosis. You are a masterpiece in progress, deserving of love, understanding, and peace.
Okay, so are you ready to dive into this 5-step process?
Oh, you know I am. Always eager for some actionable advice. Lay it on me.
All right, so step 1. It's all about observation and description. It's like hitting the pause button on that emotional roller coaster, Instead of getting swept up in all the intensity, you take a step back and simply describe what's happening. No judgment, no interpretation, just the facts.
So it's like taking a mental snapshot of the situation
Yeah.
before your own emotions start coloring the picture.
Exactly. Separating the facts from the feelings. Let's say your loved one is furious because you're late picking them up. Instead of jumping in defensively, you might say something like, "Hey, I see you're really upset that I'm late."
Okay, so you're acknowledging their anger without necessarily agreeing with how intense it is. That seems like a subtle but really important distinction.
It is. Because remember, the goal here isn't to solve the problem right away or even agree on who's right or wrong. It's about creating space for a more level-headed response by simply acknowledging what's happening in that moment.
That makes sense. So once you've observed and described, what's next?
Step 2 is all about connection. It's called participating. And it's not about offering solutions or trying to fix things. It's about actively engaging with your loved one, showing genuine interest and empathy.
So this is where those active listening skills come into play, really tuning into what they're saying and how they're feeling.
You got it. Reflecting back what you hear, asking clarifying questions, maybe even using body language that shows you're present and attentive. It can be tough, especially when you're feeling hurt or frustrated yourself. But the key is to prioritize de-escalating the situation over winning an argument.
Yeah, it sounds like it takes a lot of self-control to stay in that listening mode when things get heated.
It does, definitely. But remember, the more you practice these skills, the easier they become, and the payoff is huge. You're creating a space where your loved one feels heard, and that can really help bring those emotions down a notch.
Who has borderline personality disorder could be either male or female, so I've alternated between feminine and masculine pronouns throughout. You'll also find anecdotes and illustrations about both women and men in the book, because that reflects the reality of my professional experiences. The anecdotes are based on real people, but all names and identifying details have been changed, and in fact, most stories represent composites of people I have known. Some people believe that borderline personality disorder is much more common among women than men, but the current data are unclear, and both research evidence and clinical observation tell me it's on the rise among men. New data show that 50% of those diagnosed with BPD are men. I know that by the time you seek out this book, the demands of BPD are likely to have worn you out. A lot of people who love someone with this condition end up feeling as if they have no control over what happens to them, and this can be the most depleting feeling of all. Please know that one of my primary goals is to help you ensure your own well-being. You can't try to help your loved one change, or fight, or save your relationship if you don't take care of yourself. Fortunately, you'll find that the new ways of interacting described in this book can protect you, even restoring your sense of who you are and what's important to you. There's a lot you can do to make sure you don't end up the victim of your loved one's illness. There's also a rational approach to knowing whether you've reached the point where enough really is enough, one that depends on knowing your own heart and mind, rather than relying on the influence of well-meaning others who insist you're being manipulated and exploited.
So we've observed, we've participated. What's next on this journey?
Step 3, and this one can be the most challenging, both to wrap your head around and to actually put into practice. It's about radically accepting the situation.
Ooh, radical acceptance. That sounds intense. I'll be honest, I struggle with this one. It's hard to accept things when they feel so out of control, especially when someone's behavior is hurtful.
I hear you, it's not easy. But it's so important to remember. That radical acceptance isn't about condoning harmful behavior. It's about recognizing what is, right here, right now, even if it's painful or frustrating. It's about letting go of that need to instantly change or fix things.
So instead of resisting what's happening, you're choosing to accept it, even if you don't like it. It sounds incredibly difficult, but I can see how it could be freeing in a way.
Exactly. It's about surrendering to the present moment and recognizing that you can't force someone to change their feelings or their behavior, but what you can control is your own response.
Okay, I'm starting to see how that shift in perspective can change the whole dynamic. So what comes after acceptance?
Step 4 is all about applying those coping skills. And this is where DBT gets really practical. We're talking mindfulness, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, all those tools we talked about earlier. But here's the key. You're not just helping your loved one cope. You're using these skills for yourself too.
So it's like recognizing that you can't pour from an empty cup. You have to take care of your own emotional well-being to truly support someone else.
You got it. It might involve things like deep breathing, taking a time out to regroup, or engaging in activities that help you de-stress and recharge. It's about knowing your limits and taking steps to stay grounded, even when everything feels chaotic around you.
That makes so much sense. All right, on to the final step. What's the last piece of this puzzle?
Step 5 brings it all together. It's about being non-judgmental, extending compassion and understanding to both yourself and your loved one, even when mistakes are made.
So instead of getting caught up in blame and shame, you're choosing to approach the situation with kindness and grace.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that everyone is doing the best they can with the resources they have at that moment. It's about offering grace instead of criticism. And this is especially crucial when dealing with BPD, where guilt and shame can often be really intense.
It sounds like this non-judgmental stance can create a safer space for healing and growth, for both individuals and for the relationship itself.
Absolutely. You're right on the mark. It's about creating an environment where it's okay to make mistakes, to stumble, to not have all the answers. And that applies to both you and your loved one.
This 5-step process is so insightful, like a roadmap for navigating those rough emotional seas with more skill and compassion. But I imagine it takes practice to really master these steps.
It definitely does. Nobody's perfect right off the bat. There will be times when you fall back into old patterns or react without thinking. The key is to keep learning, keep growing, and keep extending that non-judgmental attitude to yourself as well.
It sounds like this process isn't just for those crisis situations either. It's about shifting the whole dynamic of the relationship.
You got it. By consistently applying these principles and strategies, you can build a more stable, supportive, and fulfilling relationship, even amidst the challenges of BPD.
Okay, so this 5-step process is definitely a game changer. But I know there's so much more to Dr. Manning's book. What else does she dive into?
She goes deep into understanding triggers, those specific situations or behaviors that tend to set off intense emotional reactions in your loved one. And she gives you guidance on how to respond effectively when those triggers are activated.
That seems crucial. Like, if you can anticipate and navigate those triggers, you could prevent a lot of blow-ups.
Absolutely. And she also offers really practical advice on setting those healthy boundaries we discussed, communicating your needs assertively, and managing your own self-care.
Self-care. You mentioned that earlier. And I have to admit, it's often the first thing to go out the window when I'm trying to help someone else.
I totally get it. It's easy to put our own needs on the back burner. But that's exactly why Dr. Manning emphasizes self-care so much in this book. She reminds us that we can't pour from an empty cup.
It's like that oxygen mask. This is all so insightful. But I feel like we're just scratching the surface here. I'm really curious to learn more about these specific self-care strategies.
I agree, it's a topic that deserves its own deep dive.
Perfect, because that's exactly what we'll be doing in our next segment. We'll unpack those self-care strategies, explore additional resources from the book, and leave you with some food for thought to ponder.
Stay tuned, because next time we're shifting the focus to you, the listener, and how you can navigate this journey while taking care of your own well-being.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into loving someone with borderline personality disorder. I feel like we've already uncovered so much valuable stuff, really getting to the heart of how BPD impacts relationships and how DBT can be this incredibly powerful tool for navigating all those emotional waves.
And now it's time to turn the spotlight inwards a bit. Because supporting someone with BPD, it can be like running a marathon, with all these unexpected twists and turns along the way. It takes a toll. And having a solid self-care plan in place, well, it's not just a luxury. It's essential.
And that's where Dr. Manning's focus on self-care really resonated with me. She doesn't just mention it in passing like it's an afterthought. She dedicates a good chunk of the book to explaining why it's so crucial, both for you and the health of the relationship.
Right. It's like she dismantles that myth that self-care is selfish, when in reality it's an act of self-preservation. It's what allows you to show up for your loved one in a more sustainable way, a more supportive way.
You know, I used to think self-care was all about bubble baths and spa days, which, don't get me wrong, those are great. But this book really expanded my definition. Dr. Manning talks about self-care as a holistic practice. It's about setting boundaries, managing stress, even seeking professional help when you need it.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that your needs are just as important as your loved one's needs. And it's about making a conscious effort to create space for those needs to be met, whether that's taking time for activities you enjoy, practicing mindfulness,
Right.
or simply saying no more often when you're feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah, that saying no part, that's a tough one for me. I'm working on it. But one thing that really hit home for me in the book was the importance of having a support system. It's like having this team of cheerleaders on the sidelines,
Yeah,
reminding you of your strength and resilience when you're feeling drained.
I love that analogy, the cheerleaders. And the book goes into detail about the different forms the support system can take. It might be close friends, family, a therapist, even a support group specifically for loved ones of people with BPD.
Speaking of support groups, those seem so valuable. Just having that space to connect with others who truly get it, who understand what it's like to love someone with BPD.
Absolutely, it can be so validating. They provide this safe, non-judgmental space to share your experiences, to learn from others, to gain insights from people who have walked a similar path.
It's like realizing, hey, I'm not alone in this, which can be so incredibly empowering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about emotional support either. These groups can also provide practical advice and resources. Information about BPD, treatment options, coping strategies, even local resources that you might find helpful.
Wow, this deep dive into loving someone with borderline personality disorder has been eye-opening, to say the least. I feel like I've gained so much valuable knowledge and honestly a renewed sense of hope.
I'm right there with you. What really stood out to me was the book's emphasis on understanding, validation, and compassion. Dr. Manning reminds us that while BPD presents unique challenges, it's not about labeling or blaming. It's about approaching these relationships with empathy and a commitment to growth for both people.
And she's honest about the difficulties. She doesn't sugarcoat things. She acknowledges how emotionally challenging it can be for loved ones. But she also arms you with these concrete tools and strategies to navigate those challenges while still taking care of yourself, which is so important.
Right, it's about finding that balance. And remember that thought-provoking question from Eric Gray's review. He asked if applying some of these principles, like the validation, the boundary setting, the non-judgmental communication, if those could lead to healthier relationships in general, even outside of the context of BPD.
Oh, that question really stuck with me. It made me realize that these DBT skills, they're like relationship superpowers. I mean, who wouldn't benefit from more empathy, understanding, and effective communication in their lives, right?
Couldn't agree more. It's a great reminder that this deep dive isn't just for those dealing with BPD directly. It's for anyone who wants to build stronger, more fulfilling connections with the people they care about.
So if you're feeling even a little bit intrigued by what we've talked about today, I highly recommend checking out Dr. Shari Manning's book. It's full of practical wisdom and compassionate guidance for anyone navigating the ups and downs of loving someone with BPD.
And remember, You're not alone on this journey. There are resources out there, support groups, professionals who can help. Keep learning, keep growing, and don't hesitate to reach out for support when you need it.
That's great advice. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive, but keep those conversations going, folks. And until next time, happy reading.
But today, I have an exciting announcement for all of you book lovers and mental health enthusiasts. In an upcoming episode, we'll be diving into an incredibly impactful book, It Didn't Start With You: How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle by Mark Wallen. This book takes a deep look at how the traumas of previous generations can affect us and offers practical tools to break free from those cycles. Trust me, this is a book you won't want to miss. So, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you'll be the first to know when the review drops. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content that inspires growth and understanding. Thank you for being a part of our Mental Pages community, and I can't wait to explore this life-changing book with you soon. See you soon on Mental Pages. Let's turn the page to better mental health.